The old saying is a terrorist can attack any place, anytime, using any technique.
Welcome back. In our Worldly Today, an ominous warning from European intelligence officials. ISIS is plotting more large-scale Paris-style attacks from training camps outside Syria, according to a report released this morning. The threat of terrorism across Europe is at its highest level in more than a decade. Adding to that, a warning from the French that ISIS has created a fake passport industry, making travel between countries for would-be jihadis theoretically even easier. Let's get right to CNN's chief national security correspondent Jim Sciutto live in Washington. Jim, where else are these plots being developed according to the Europol report?
Well, Jake, the most severe threat, they say, is to France and to Britain. But in fact, European authorities consider the threat is Europe-wide, and it doesn't stop there. Counterterror officials both in Europe and here in the U.S. say ISIS is increasingly a global terror group with global aspirations. It has an ample supply of recruits and certainly as well growing capability.
A violent new ISIS video features the men who carried out the Paris attacks, purporting to show their final messages. And the video ends with an ominous new warning. The terror group will strike Britain next. The terror threat to Europe, says Europol, is the most severe in more than a decade. ISIS and other terror groups likely to attempt significant coordinated attacks similar to the deadly rampage in Paris.
Islamic State has a willingness and a capability to carry out further attacks in Europe. And of course, all of the national authorities across Europe are working to prevent that from happening.
But tonight it's a different group that's sounding alarms in Washington, the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front. A new report finds that Nusra has a greater capability to carry out catastrophic 9/11 scale attacks on U.S. soil, drawing on the resources of core al-Qaeda in Pakistan and around the world. Like ISIS, al-Nusra controls swaths of territory in Syria and has attracted scores of foreign fighters. Still, European and U.S. officials see ISIS as the more immediate threat, and the terror group is expanding its presence in the West, with training sites inside Europe and the ability to manufacture their own passports at will. One alarming example, the ISIS-inspired man who attacked a police station in Paris last month.
The person who intended to attack this police station had passports of 7 countries, various alias names, and a criminal record in the least 3 member states under different names.
Now, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the crisis in Syria and Iraq, Europe is rapidly elevating its border controls to make sure that terrorists don't slip in, pretending to be refugees. The U.S. is aware that ISIS has the capability to make authentic-looking Syrian passports.
Part of the territory they took over happened to have a building where the Syrians process passports. So they have blank passports, and they have the means to print them and fake them.
Now, a key and somewhat contrarian point from this Europol report is that Europe, it says, faces a greater military or militant threat, rather, from inside its borders than from terrorists posing as refugees. The report says that ISIS has now established an External Actions Command, in effect, a military division for carrying out attacks abroad, in particular, special forces-style attacks like the one, Jake, you and I saw in Paris.
Jim Sciutto, thanks so much. Joining me now to talk about this and much more, former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He ran the Pentagon under both Presidents Gerald Ford and most recently, of course, George W. Bush. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for being here. You're unveiling a new app that you've developed called Churchill Solitaire, which I want to get to in a minute, and I found very addictive. But I do want to ask you a couple questions about military matters. Do you think ISIS can be defeated with the way the campaign is being waged right now by the U.S.? That is, airstrikes, some special operations forces, 3,000 or so troops, largely in Iraq, serving as trainers and guides. Can ISIS be defeated with that U.S. force?
I think the answer is probably no, but it certainly is unlikely. If you think about it, the old saying is a terrorist can attack any place, any time, using any technique, and it's physically impossible to defend at every location, at every time of the day of night, and against every conceivable technique. Now, the only way it will be defeated is to recognize that it's going to be a long haul, many, many years, that the old principle of economics, if you want more of something, reward it. If you want less of it, penalize it. And that means penalize it. The only way to succeed is to penalize it. And that means you're going to have to cut off the recruits that are coming in and begin to get a sense of how many are coming in. And interfere with their recruiting capability. And second, to reduce their financing and interfere with the, make it a penalty for financing terrorism. And to the extent that a country is either ungoverned or creates an environment that's hospitable as a base to organize and train and equip terrorists, that kind of an ungoverned area or a hospitable area has to be eliminated.
There was a story in Politics a few weeks ago that broke, and I wondered what you thought of it. Your friend, the Vice President, former Vice President Dick Cheney, was critical of it. The proposal to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. Do you think a proposal like that would make America safer or less safe?
Well, it seems to me in the last analysis, the problem is going to be dealt with certainly by people who are not Muslims, but it also has to be dealt with by people within that faith. And the number of extremist Islamists within the faith is a minority. But a minority that's not trivial, and it's well-armed, well-financed, and well-organized, and very successful on social media in terms of recruiting. So I can't see that banning people of that faith makes sense, because we're going to need to recruit them, and we're going to need to engage them, and we're going to need to have their support and cooperation if we're to prevail. Now, do we have to do a darn good job of vetting people? You bet.
Yeah.
And the report you just presented with the ease people have of falsifying documentation to get in and out of countries is a terribly worrisome thing.
I wanted to get your response to this story in Politico, quoting a 2002 memo that came across your desk. You wrote, "This is big," and you forwarded it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It basically said that the intelligence about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction program was not very reliable, 0% to 75%. You posted it on your website, this memo, in 2011.
Yes.
But it's getting new attention. Do you think this is a memo that might have had an effect if it had been released publicly, or the lack of knowledge?
Well, that knowledge there was no lack of knowledge. The Joint Chiefs were participant in all the intelligence discussions, all the intelligence gathering process. The Director of Central Intelligence had people in the State Department, he had people in the Central Intelligence
I mean
Agency.
the lack of knowledge about the WMD program, the idea that it was so unreliable, that maybe that didn't...
But that was one scrap of information along with all the other information that was presented to the Director of Central Intelligence, who had the responsibility of taking all of that and then presenting it to the President and to Secretary Powell, who made the presentation to the United Nations. All of that information was available.
Let's turn to Churchill Solitaire, your new app, which is the 6th most downloaded app this week, I believe, and 150,000 people. Let's just show this a little bit. This is here it is. The cards are going right here. Explain to us what we're seeing here. This is the most complicated set of. It's 2 packs.
It's 2 full decks, 104 cards, and it's got 10 rows, and it's got 6 cards, the Devil's Row up on top, and there's similarities to Solitaire, but in fact it is vastly more complex, and it requires strategy, because you have choices you have to make. And you really do have to look 3 and 4 and 5 steps ahead.
I think that's the problem I've been having. I've been able to solve one game. I think I'm thinking 2 steps ahead, but you really have to think 3 or 4.
You do.
And here's the thing. Now there are at least 150,000 of us who know this game. A week or 2 ago, it was what, like 10 people knew?
Not many. Winston Churchill taught a man named Andre de Stark, who taught me and several other people, and then I've taught some people over the years. But I think it's a wonderful game. It's so challenging and difficult that it seemed to me it should not be lost to the ages. So we found some folks who are very talented in making an app for an iPad. And I've enjoyed it a great deal. I think others will. You can also play it competitively. There's a way you can challenge other people on the internet and see if you
I'm not there yet.
Okay, you'll get there.
You think so?
Yeah,
You have faith in me?
absolutely. It's a wonderful, wonderful game.
Other than saying I have to think 3 or 4 moves ahead? Is there anything I need to know?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think organizing black and red up above alternating helps. I think also that you've got to remember that on the Devil's Row, the upper six, what you need to do is to know you've got to get those cars. You can't play them down. You can only play them over. But you can handle it. You're a Churchill buff.
I am a Churchill buff, as are you, I know. Thank you so much for being here. Good to see you again.
Thank
sir.
you.
Congratulations on the app.
Thank you.
Coming up, they